we have this horrible thing called a homeowners association. The main function of which seems to be that we are compelled to get together once a year to argue about something. And sometimes we argue about what we're going to argue about. But usually it's something weighty, like what color you can paint your mailbox. And so, I don't know, you may have homeowners associations that you value and you cherish, but mine is a pretty cantankerous bunch of people. So ordinarily I dread it. But I am indebted to it for one thing in particular, and that is that it was 7 years ago that the meeting was at my house. And at the end of the meeting, a lady I knew then only as Judy came up to me, and she said that she'd been reading my first book, Under a Flaming Sky, to her father, and he was really enjoying that, and that he was in the last couple months of his life and living under hospice care at her home. And she wondered if I would come down to meet him and talk about that book. So I said, of course. And I think it was the next day I went down to her house. And I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rantz. And Joe was stretched out on a recliner. And he was on oxygen. And he was quite weak physically. But he was very alert mentally. And I sat down and we talked just a little bit about that earlier book of mine. And then Judy began to steer the conversation towards her dad's experience growing up during the Depression. If you read the book, you know he had a very challenging personal family situation he had to overcome as a kid. And that really affected me. Then he went on and he began to talk about how he came to row on crew at the University of Washington beginning in the fall of 1933, and how that had begun to redeem his life, and how he and his crewmates had wound up rowing for a gold medal in Berlin against a German boat in front of Adolf Hitler and all the top Nazis, and my jaw just dropped open. What I didn't know was that Judy had been for years looking for somebody to write her dad's story. She had laid a bit of a trap, and it worked, because I was absolutely mesmerized from that first conversation with Joe. And I noticed during that conversation that whenever Joe began to talk about any of the other boys in the boat, he would tear up. And that really caught my attention. I knew there was something going on here, a lot of heart. So I'm usually very reserved and picky about picking book topics, but I couldn't resist. I just blurted out. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And I'll never forget this. He immediately shook his head and he looked down at the floor. And he said, no, I don't want you to look at me. But then he looked up, and he had these tears in his eyes again. And he sort of croaked out. He said, but you could write a book about the boat. And at first I didn't know what he meant. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell that George Pocock had built that they had rowed in. But then, of course, I very quickly realized that by the boat he meant the boat itself, those other boys that had rowed with him, what they had all done together, and even more than that, what they had all become together that summer in Berlin 75 years ago. That perfect, beautiful, living, breathing thing that a great crew team, a great crew is. And so that was what I committed myself to do. And I set out on the next day on what turned out to be about a 4.5-year odyssey of research and writing to get to the heart of the story. And that in time turned into The Boys in the Boat.